Well, you would have seen today the developments around our unemployment rate. 32.6% of those who want to work are unemployed. That's a very slight improvement. To put it another way, the number of people who are working in the second quarter of the year rose to 16.3 million. Dr Nthabiseng Moleko is a development economist at the Stellenbosch Business School. Dr. Moleko, good afternoon to you. Is there any particular reason why the number of people with jobs or the number of jobs went up slightly? And Dr. Moleko, I realize this is irrational, but I'd like to hope this is part of a small, sustained growth in the number of people working.
Thank you so much for having me. And I like the word slight that you use. Listen, I think from a statistical perspective, what we're seeing is that it's a 0.3% increase in the second quarter. And is that really anything to call an increase? It's barely a percentage point. The reality is the more than 16 million people that are were actively employed prior to COVID-19, we have not reached that number. So we are currently at a level lower than what was the case in 2020. And I think the real question is what should be done in order to improve our unemployment numbers, because the number of unemployed, even though you're talking about a 32.9 to 32.6 decrease, if you look at the expanded definition, it's stuck, and stubbornly so, above 42%. And this has been the case for several quarters. And so it tells you that there's a systemic problem in the employment and in the labor market. And there's really nothing to be happy or smile about with these results that we have.
Obviously, load shedding is a big factor. I say this because, again, irrationally, I hope that it may end in the next year or so. If it does, will that make much difference? Or are the factors that mitigate against that just too big?
So, absolutely. There are definite signs that the performance of business, particularly which sectors have actually seen some change, is directly related to enablers such as, of course, electricity, energy, and the availability of energy. So I do believe that there is an impact that business has had because of the inability and the fluctuating supply of energy across economic sectors. So what we have seen in the quarter-on-quarter change and in the gains in the last sectoral labor force survey results is that a small change, a total of 154,000 we've seen in terms of this is part of the gains, but we have seen a decline, 96,000 in manufacturing, utility 6,000. We are seeing also the same in transport, in finance, and the sectors that are gaining are your services sectors. So your hard utilities, your sectors that are labor absorptive, continue to shed more jobs, and we're not seeing the attrition, but also the rate at which we need them to increase, given the conundrum of the labor market. We are not seeing the type of gains we need. So the only one that I would say is labor intensive that we haven't seen a positive gain is construction. 104,000 people have been increased. But remember, Stephen, the issue in South Africa is not about the minute gains. We are facing, I would say, labor market crises where you have more than 1 million people entering the labor market per annum. Less than 200,000 of those are able to enter into universities, and the bulk of those remain in the labor market, and they're not necessarily planned for in the labor system. So where are they going? How do we manage? That is why the unemployment rate is so high, is that there's simply systemically nothing being done. We simply look every quarter at what's happening with agriculture, mining, manufacturing, construction, and some of the services sectors, and we're seeing some of the minor gains. But systemically, we're not seeing the systemic shift that is required so that you see a sizable dent in the million that enter the labor force per annum. And that is what really needs to be the discussion, to say what must be done in the labor force so that we see a sizable dent. We can talk about the 0.3% in decline, which is not going to show a monumental impact across the provinces and even in the trends where we see social problems because of the large number of our youth that are unemployed. So we really have to have a type of a different discussion.
There's also a huge gender dynamic to this. Is that also systemic, the fact that there are 2 million more men who are employed than women, when women by far are the majority of the population. That must also be systemic.
Absolutely. So what we have seen is that in terms of the sectoral employment changes, even from a gender dynamic, firstly, it is the face of the black woman, primarily black women who have seen and are hardest hit in terms of not just the onset from COVID, but even the attrition and the increase in the number of women who are joined in the different industries post. So you haven't seen those who lost their jobs gain their jobs, and you're not seeing the gain coming from the formal sector to the extent that you would want to see. The second aspect, if you see employment increase, particularly in the informal sector, you see there that a lot of jobs were recorded amongst the informal sectors that are also part of the labor force survey, by the way. But you know that the majority of our people that are in the informal sector, those that have lost and are not necessarily gaining attrition again, are those that are sectors that are not that are definitely having the gender dynamic that you're talking about. So again, here in informal sector, you have your community and social services. Largely, the bulk of those it's women, and in the main black women. You also see some of the other subsectors that contribute to these as your construction and transport. But what we're finding in terms of the changes is that at what level the labor force survey talk about occupations. So employment by occupations, they measure domestic workers, right? They measure managers, they measure professionals, they measure the skilled services and the different services. And you're seeing the bulk of losses are not just in agriculture, in related trade, but you're also seeing a drop in the number of people that are working in our private sector, in our households. Domestic workers have declined. You're seeing a decline also occurring in your crafts and your related. And these are some of the sectors and occupations which would explain why the number of women is not necessarily gaining traction, because you are bleeding jobs in these sectors. You're also bleeding jobs in the managerial and professional space. You are bleeding jobs in skilled agriculture, quite substantially so, with 29% year-on-year change in the skilled agricultural sector. So what we're seeing is that there are some massive losses in employment. And for us to understand what needs to be done is to look at where are the subsectors and the occupations where we are seeing the losses, and therefore, how therefore do we respond to these year-on-year changes, because they are quite substantial and they are telling of the sectors that are not growing and the sectors that are growing, the sectors that are not performing so well and the sectors that are improving. And we are seeing very large losses in sectors that are labor absorptive, and this has been an ongoing trend in the South African economic story, and simply put, nothing is being done to circumvent the continued losses in these sectors.
It may be, I suppose, worth remembering, Dr. Moleko, two facts that to add to what you say. The one is that unemployment is a regional problem. So Eswatini, Lesotho, Botswana, Zimbabwe, all of the countries that border us have pretty much the same problem. And the other is that unemployment in South Africa has been rising really since the 1970s, apart from one sort of period in the early 2000s. So within all of that, there's been talk about a social pact, talk of structural reform to our economy. And I think people, and I think the government, I suppose the same party in government, but different people in government, have been talking about those things for as long as I've been reporting on South Africa, which is longer than I want to mention. 20 years. The point is there any reason to believe there'll be any reform now? Because I don't see any reason to believe it.
I think that's a difficult question in that it's a leadership question, to be honest, Stephen. The issue of how institutions are being aligned to make sure that they have development impact. And I think the question of impact is what we want to see, whether it's looking at the policy decisions that are made and whether or not there is impact. What we have seen, and you're correct, that there has been a lot of discussion. There have been a lot of summits. There have been a lot of green papers, white papers. There have been a lot of strategies. And it's not just an issue of whether there's been implementation, Stephen. The issue here is whether the strategies that we have and we are employing are actually going to deal with the underdevelopment woes. And what we have seen, and what I have been arguing for several years now, is that South Africa does need to have a rethinking of the economic system. And let me start at the beginning. Our economy is an extractive economy. We have been set up from an infrastructure perspective. Even the financial system and the financial markets have been established following the mineral energy complex, enabling that the resources, and we see it with the trade port and the argument around the inefficiencies of Transnet and our freight rail, where we are arguing vehemently that we want to export our mineral products and we want to export them fast out of here. And you understand that within that context is the argument that says Africa, together with South Africa, is an extractive economy where we simply extracting our resources, extracting our mineral wealth to the highest bidder. The issue then becomes, how do we reconfigure this so that this wealth that we have works for the people? What does that mean for the financial system? What does that mean for our labor market? What does that mean for our manufacturing system? And what does that mean for re-engineering, right, our state-owned enterprises and our railway system, our shipping, our electricity, all of these enablers in terms of re-engineering them for what and for who? My thinking is that we must re-engineer these SOEs, these enterprises that are not performing as efficiently and as well as we want, to industrialize our economies, to ensure that we are beneficiating, to ensure that the different sectors of our economies are reignited to not just be consumptive and consumption-led, but to actually contribute to development and to ensure that SMMEs that are black-owned, woman-owned, youth-owned play a part and a very definitive role in that. But that requires a complete reshift, because right now the discourse is more about, how do we give crumbs to the people through what we call grants? How do we ensure that people are, continuing to be dependent on the state? We're not talking about re-engineering the economic system. We're not talking about re-engineering some of the structural systemic issues so that we are not just extractive. And that issue remains from 1884 Berlin Declaration. We have not had a discussion to say, why are we not reinvigorating the economy to ensure the gains and the wealth of the minerals reaches the people? And I think for me, we've got to have that discussion. If it takes a compact, what you're talking about is social compact. I'm saying we've got to have, and I've heard various people talk about an economic CODESA, but we've got to have a discussion on the economic model, the economic mechanisms, the economic system that is required to share the wealth, because that is what is needed in this country. And I think that the council, I've spoken once about a coordinating council that can begin these discussions with different players, but we need a different discussion, Stephen, and I think that's what we need as a country, because it can be done. It has been done by other countries. It should be done by South Africa. We are a wealthy country. We cannot be talking about the woes of the country all the time. We have so much potential, and I believe in the potential of this country, but I think we need different decisions to be taken to lead us to the type of land of milk and honey that I envisage for this country.
Dr Nthabiseng Moleko, thank you. Development economist at Stellenbosch Business School.